Humans have spent centuries rewriting history. Today, we're putting the original version back on the shelf. If you think history class gave you the whole story, think again. Some of the most famous facts you've heard since childhood were never facts at all. They were misunderstandings, patriotic myths, oversimplified stories, or legends that became more popular than the truth. Stick around, because the deeper we go, the more unbelievable these historical lies become. And some of the biggest ones are probably still sitting in your memory right now. One of the biggest lies many of us learned in school is that Christopher Columbus proved the Earth was round. It makes for a neat little classroom story. Brave explorer sails west, while everyone else believes he'll fall off the edge of the world. The problem is, that's almost entirely fiction. By the time Columbus set sail in 1492, educated Europeans had known the Earth was spherical for well over 1,000 years. Ancient Greek scholars like Eratosthenes had even calculated its circumference with surprising accuracy centuries before the Roman Empire reached its height. Columbus wasn't challenging a flat Earth society. He was arguing that the planet was much smaller than experts believed. Ironically, he was wrong. Had North and South America not been sitting between Europe and Asia, his crew would have run out of food long before reaching Japan. The real miracle wasn't proving the Earth was round. It was surviving an expedition built on a mathematical mistake that accidentally changed world history forever. 2. We've all heard the dramatic story that Isaac Newton discovered gravity because an apple fell directly onto his head. It's one of those classroom tales that's impossible to forget because it's simple, funny, and easy to imagine. Unfortunately, there's no solid evidence it ever happened that way. Years later, Newton himself told friends that watching an apple fall from a tree made him think about why objects always fall toward the earth instead of sideways or upward. Notice the important difference. The apple inspired a question. It didn't knock genius into him like some magical piece of fruit with perfect aim. Newton spent decades developing the mathematics behind gravity, filling notebooks with calculations that most of us wouldn't survive reading for 5 minutes. The famous apple became a convenient shortcut for teachers trying to explain one of history's greatest scientific breakthroughs. It's a wonderful story, but the real discovery came from years of relentless thinking, not a lucky hit from Mother Nature. 3. Almost everyone remembers hearing that medieval Europeans believed the Earth was flat until Columbus came along. Like many historical myths, it survives because it's simple enough to fit into a single sentence. The truth is far more interesting. Scholars throughout the Middle Ages routinely taught that the Earth was a sphere. Universities used ancient Greek and Roman texts that described the planet's shape, and sailors understood perfectly well that ships disappeared hull first over the horizon because of Earth's curvature. Even medieval artwork often depicted the globe as a sphere. The flat Earth myth didn't become widespread until the 19th century, when several writers exaggerated history to make the Middle Ages appear far more ignorant than they really were. Ironically, generations of students ended up believing a completely modern myth about ancient beliefs. In other words, history class sometimes taught a fake story about people supposedly believing fake stories. That's a level of historical irony, almost impressive enough to deserve its own textbook chapter. 4. Napoleon Bonaparte is remembered as the tiny emperor who tried to conquer Europe while barely being able to see over a dining table. It's one of the most persistent myths in history, but it simply isn't true. Napoleon stood around 5 feet 6 or 7 inches tall by modern measurements, making him almost exactly average for a Frenchman living in the early 19th century. So where did the image of the miniature dictator come from? Part of the confusion came from the difference between French and British measuring systems, which made his recorded height seem shorter after a poor conversion. British newspapers also loved mocking their greatest enemy, regularly calling him Little Boney in political cartoons to make him appear weak and ridiculous. Add the fact that Napoleon often surrounded himself with the elite imperial guard, whose soldiers were exceptionally tall, and he naturally looked shorter, standing beside them. Over time, propaganda became accepted as history. Ironically, one of the most feared military commanders in European history lost his reputation not because of a battlefield defeat, but because generations believed a joke that was repeated often enough to sound like fact. 5. If Hollywood has taught us anything, it's that Vikings wore massive horned helmets while charging into battle like the world's loudest heavy metal band. The image is unforgettable, but historians have spent years explaining that it isn't accurate. Archaeologists have uncovered thousands of Viking artifacts, including weapons, armor, tools, and helmets. None of the genuine battle helmets have horns attached. In fact, adding large horns would have made combat far more dangerous by giving opponents something easy to grab during a fight. The famous horned helmet actually became popular in the 19th century, when costume designers creating Richard Wagner's operas wanted Viking characters to look more dramatic on stage. Audiences loved the theatrical design, artists copied it, and eventually movies, cartoons, and advertisements turned it into historical fact. The real Vikings were already intimidating enough without looking like walking coat racks. They relied on speed, excellent shipbuilding, disciplined fighting, and fearless raids, not oversized costume accessories that would have gotten them knocked into the nearest fjord. 6. Ask almost anyone what the Great Wall of China is famous for besides its incredible size, and you'll probably hear the same answer. It's the only man-made structure visible from space. It sounds impressive, but astronauts have been patiently correcting this myth for decades. From low Earth orbit, where the International Space Station travels, many human-made features can be seen under the right lighting conditions, including cities, highways, airports, and large bridges. The Great Wall, however, is surprisingly difficult to spot because it's relatively narrow and often blends into the surrounding mountains and landscape. From the moon, the claim becomes even more impossible. At that distance, even entire continents lack fine detail, making individual structures invisible to the naked eye. The myth became popular long before humans ever reached space, appearing in books during the early 20th century as a simple guess rather than an observation. Once textbooks repeated it, millions accepted it without question. Sometimes the biggest thing about history isn't the monument itself, it's the myth built around it. 7. Marie Antoinette supposedly heard that starving French peasants had no bread and casually replied, "Let them eat cake." It's one of history's most famous examples of royal arrogance, and almost certainly something she never said. The phrase actually appeared in print years before Marie Antoinette even arrived in France. One of its earliest appearances comes from philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who mentioned a great princess making the remark while the future queen was still a child living in Austria. During the French Revolution, the public desperately wanted symbols of everything they hated about the monarchy. Marie Antoinette, being young, foreign, wealthy, and unpopular, became the perfect target. Pamphlets blamed her for countless problems, many of them exaggerated or completely fabricated. The famous cake quote fit perfectly into that campaign because it captured the image revolutionaries wanted people to believe. Historians today agree there's no reliable evidence she ever uttered those words. Yet the fictional sentence became so powerful that it overshadowed the complicated reality of one of history's most controversial queens. 8. We've all seen paintings of pilgrims sitting peacefully beside Native Americans at the very first Thanksgiving, sharing a perfect meal that somehow solved everyone's problems forever. It's a comforting story, but the real history is much more complicated. The 1621 Harvest Feast in Plymouth did happen, and members of the Wampanoag people did join the English colonists. However, it wasn't the official beginning of an annual holiday, nor was it a symbol of permanent friendship. The gathering lasted several days and likely included venison, wild birds, seafood, and local crops rather than the modern menu of turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, and pumpkin pie. More importantly, the decades that followed were marked by increasing conflict, land disputes, disease, and devastating wars that forever changed indigenous communities across New England. The traditional classroom version often skips those difficult chapters in favor of a simple feel-good ending. The real story isn't less important because it's more complicated. In fact, understanding both the cooperation and the conflict gives a far more honest picture of America's earliest colonial history. 9 school textbooks often leave the impression that Thomas Edison sat alone in a workshop, invented the light bulb one evening, and instantly changed the world. Reality was far less dramatic and much more collaborative. Long before Edison entered the race, several inventors had already developed working electric lamps. The biggest challenge wasn't making a bulb glow, it was creating one that lasted long enough, stayed affordable, and could be used as part of an entire electrical system. Edison and his team improved existing designs by developing a longer-lasting filament, refining manufacturing methods, and building the generators, wiring, and infrastructure needed to bring electric lighting into homes and businesses. His greatest talent wasn't inventing every idea from scratch. It was improving technology, organizing brilliant researchers, and turning inventions into practical products people could actually use. History sometimes prefers a lone genius because it's easier to remember than a team of engineers working through thousands of failed experiments. The light bulb wasn't born in one magical moment. It was the result of persistence, innovation, and relentless refinement. 10. One of the most famous stories from the American Revolution claims that George Washington had wooden teeth. It's memorable, slightly funny, and completely misleading. Washington certainly suffered from terrible dental problems throughout his adult life, losing most of his natural teeth long before becoming president. He owned several sets of dentures, but none were carved from wood. Instead, they were made from a combination of materials that sounds uncomfortable, even by 18th century standards. Human teeth purchased from donors, animal teeth from cows and horses, carved ivory from hippopotamuses and elephants, and carefully crafted metal components. Over time, those ivory pieces stained and cracked, creating a rough brown appearance that may have inspired the wooden teeth myth. Wearing the dentures was reportedly painful, and portraits often show Washington with a stiff expression, partly because speaking and smiling could be difficult. The truth is actually far more fascinating than the legend. America's first president wasn't walking around with a mouthful of lumber. He was enduring one of history's most uncomfortable examples of early dental technology. 11. The Salem Witch Trials are often remembered as a time when accused witches were burned alive at the stake across colonial Massachusetts. It's one of those images that appears in movies so often that many people assume it really happened. In reality, none of the victims of the Salem trials were burned. Between 1692 and 1693, 19 people were executed by hanging after being convicted of witchcraft, while one elderly man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death under heavy stones after refusing to enter a plea. Several others died in prison while awaiting trial. Burning people for witchcraft was practiced in parts of continental Europe, but it was not the method used in Salem. The confusion probably comes from mixing together different witch hunts that took place across Europe over several centuries. Salem was already tragic enough without adding fictional details. The real horror wasn't how the accused died. It was how quickly fear, rumors, and questionable evidence convinced neighbors to destroy one another's lives in the name of justice. 12. Every schoolchild has heard that the American Declaration of Independence was signed on July 4, 1776, in one dramatic moment with all the Founding Fathers gathered around the same table. It's a wonderful painting, but history unfolded much more slowly. Congress officially adopted the Declaration on July 4th, and that is why Americans celebrate Independence Day. However, most delegates did not sign the famous parchment that day. The beautifully handwritten copy wasn't even ready until weeks later, and the majority of signatures were added on August 2nd. Some delegates signed even later because they weren't present in Philadelphia at the time. The iconic image of everyone proudly signing together was popularized by John Trumbull's famous painting, which actually depicts the committee presenting the draft rather than the signing itself. It's another case where a powerful piece of artwork quietly reshaped public memory. The Declaration remains one of history's greatest political documents, but its creation looked far more like weeks of paperwork than one unforgettable afternoon. 13. King George III is often remembered as the insane tyrant who single-handedly caused the American Revolution through madness and cruelty. The real picture is considerably more complicated. George III did experience episodes of serious illness later in life, likely related to a medical condition that historians still debate, but those famous mental health crises occurred years after the American colonies declared independence. During the Revolution itself, he was actively involved in government, yet Britain was governed through parliament, ministers, and complicated political negotiations. Many of the taxes and policies that angered the colonies originated through parliamentary decisions rather than personal royal decrees. American propaganda naturally portrayed the king as the face of British oppression because every revolution needs a recognizable villain. Over time, that simplified version became the one many students remembered. George III certainly opposed American independence, but he wasn't the cartoon dictator history class sometimes presents. The revolution was driven by political disagreements, imperial economics, and constitutional arguments, not simply because one unstable king woke up in a bad mood. 14. The famous image of the Wild West tells us every cowboy carried 2 revolvers, wore polished spurs, and spent afternoons facing rivals in dramatic duels down dusty streets. Reality was much less cinematic. Most cowboys weren't gunfighters at all. They were hard-working ranch employees who spent exhausting days driving cattle across hundreds of miles, repairing fences, branding livestock, and sleeping outdoors in every kind of weather. Carrying expensive revolvers wasn't always practical, and many towns across the frontier actually enforced surprisingly strict gun control laws, requiring visitors to surrender their weapons before entering. Famous shootouts like the one at the OK Corral were incredibly rare, which is exactly why they became legendary. The Hollywood version of the West owes far more to 20th century movies than 19th century history. Real cowboys worried less about quick-draw contests and more about storms, broken horses, disease, and getting paid at the end of a long cattle drive. The frontier was dangerous enough without constant movie-style gunfights happening every afternoon. 15. Many people believe that the pyramids of Egypt were built entirely by armies of slaves whipped into submission under the blazing desert sun. Modern archaeology tells a very different story. Excavations near the pyramids have uncovered workers' villages, bakeries, medical facilities, and cemeteries, showing that many laborers were skilled, organized workers who received food, housing, and medical treatment. They were often farmers recruited during the annual flooding of the Nile when agricultural work temporarily stopped. These massive construction projects became a form of national labor supported by taxation and royal authority rather than endless chains of enslaved workers. That doesn't mean the work was easy. It was physically exhausting, dangerous, and required incredible organization. But the popular image created by centuries of novels and films oversimplifies one of history's greatest engineering achievements. The pyramids weren't built by magical aliens or endless columns of beaten slaves. They were built by thousands of highly organized human workers whose remarkable skills still leave engineers impressed more than 4,000 years later. 16. Everyone knows Paul Revere rode through the night shouting, "The British are coming," as he warned the American colonists. It's one of the most famous scenes in American history, thanks largely to Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's famous poem. The real mission looked very different. Revere wasn't alone. Other writers, including William Dawes and Samuel Prescott, carried similar warnings across the countryside. More importantly, Revere almost certainly never shouted those famous words while galloping through villages. The mission depended on secrecy because British soldiers were already nearby. Loudly announcing his presence would have guaranteed immediate arrest. Besides, most colonists still considered themselves British subjects, making the phrase itself somewhat misleading. Instead, Revere quietly alerted local patriot leaders as he traveled from town to town. Longfellow's poem, written decades later, intentionally simplified the story to inspire national unity before the Civil War. It worked so well that poetry eventually replaced historical reality in millions of classrooms, turning one important messenger into the lone hero of an unforgettable legend. 17. One of the strangest myths repeated in classrooms is that medieval people almost never bathed because they simply didn't care about cleanliness. While hygiene standards were certainly different from today's expectations, the idea that everyone happily lived in permanent filth is wildly exaggerated. Throughout much of the Middle Ages, public bathhouses operated across many European cities. Wealthy families maintained private bathing facilities, and written records regularly mention washing, grooming, and changing clothes. Soap was widely known, and personal cleanliness was considered desirable, even if access varied depending on wealth and location. The decline of public bathhouses happened gradually for several reasons, including outbreaks of disease and changing religious attitudes, not because Europeans suddenly forgot what water was for. Renaissance writers and later historians often exaggerated medieval dirtiness to make their own eras appear more civilized. Hollywood happily embraced that stereotype because muddy streets and filthy castles looked dramatic on screen. The truth is less extreme. Medieval life could certainly be dirty, but people generally preferred being clean whenever circumstances allowed. 18 school lessons often suggest that the first Thanksgiving was instantly recognized as the beginning of a beloved American holiday celebrated every year without interruption. In reality, Thanksgiving developed slowly over more than 2 centuries. After the 1621 Harvest Feast, there wasn't a nationwide annual tradition. Different colonies and later different states occasionally proclaimed days of Thanksgiving to celebrate military victories, successful harvests, or other important events. Some years there were celebrations, while other years there weren't any at all. It wasn't until 1863, during the middle of the Civil War, that President Abraham Lincoln proclaimed a national Thanksgiving holiday to encourage unity in a deeply divided country. Even then, the exact date continued to change until Congress officially fixed it in the 20th century. The modern family tradition owes just as much to 19th century writers, politicians, and cultural campaigns as it does to the original Plymouth gathering. Like many famous holidays, Thanksgiving wasn't born fully formed. It gradually evolved into the celebration millions of families know today. 19 Julius Caesar is often remembered as the emperor who ruled ancient Rome with absolute power before being assassinated by jealous senators. The only problem is that Caesar was never actually a Roman emperor. He served as dictator, military commander, and politician during the final years of the Roman Republic. His growing authority certainly paved the way for imperial rule, but the title of Rome's first emperor is generally given to his adopted heir, Augustus, who established a more stable political system after years of civil war. The confusion is understandable because Caesar became so famous that later Roman rulers adopted Caesar as an imperial title, eventually turning it into words like Kaiser in Germany and Tsar in Russia. Over time, people naturally assumed the original Caesar must have been an emperor himself. His assassination in 44 BC marked the end of one political era and opened the door to another, but history became a little blurred along the way. Sometimes the most famous title in history belongs to the man who never officially held it. 21 of the most popular stories about the Pilgrims claims they came to America seeking complete religious freedom for everyone. While they certainly wanted the freedom to practice their own faith, the reality was much narrower. The Pilgrims left England after facing religious pressure and eventually settled in Plymouth, hoping to build a community based on their own beliefs. However, they were not champions of universal religious tolerance in the modern sense. Within their own colonies, they expected conformity, and people who openly challenged accepted religious practices often faced punishment, banishment, or legal consequences. Other colonial leaders, particularly in neighboring Massachusetts Bay, were even stricter. Figures like Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson were expelled for expressing ideas that colonial authorities considered dangerous. The concept of broad religious liberty developed gradually over many generations through debate, conflict, and changing political ideas. The Pilgrims undeniably sought freedom, but primarily for themselves. History becomes much more interesting once we realize that the freedoms many societies value today were achieved through a long, complicated process rather than arriving fully formed with the very first settlers. 21. One of the most common stories about the Middle Ages is that people believed tomatoes were poisonous because the fruit itself was deadly. The truth is far stranger. Tomatoes belong to the nightshade family, which certainly made some Europeans suspicious when they first arrived from the Americas in the 16th century. But the biggest problem wasn't the tomato at all. It was the dinner plate. Wealthy Europeans often ate from pewter plates that contained large amounts of lead. Tomatoes are naturally acidic, and when they sat on those plates, they could dissolve enough lead to cause serious poisoning. People became sick after eating tomatoes and naturally blamed the bright red fruit instead of their expensive tableware. The poor, who used wooden bowls, often had no such problem. Over time, tomatoes slowly gained acceptance, especially in Italy and Spain, where cooks discovered they were delicious rather than dangerous. It took generations for science to separate coincidence from cause. The tomato wasn't trying to kill anyone. The plates were simply doing a much better job than the vegetables ever could. 22. Ask someone who invented the telephone, and you'll almost always hear the same answer: Alexander Graham Bell. While Bell absolutely deserves credit for developing and commercializing the first practical telephone system, the story isn't nearly that simple. Throughout the 19th century, inventors across Europe and America were racing to solve the same challenge: transmitting the human voice electrically. Perhaps the most fascinating figure was Italian inventor Antonio Meucci, who built working voice communication devices years before Bell filed his famous patent. Unfortunately, Meucci lacked the financial resources to fully protect his work, and many of his documents were reportedly lost. Bell's breakthrough came through refining existing ideas, securing a strong patent, and building a successful business around the technology. Historians continue debating exactly how much each inventor contributed, but one thing is certain: no revolutionary invention appears out of thin air. Great discoveries usually grow from decades of experimentation by many brilliant people working toward the same goal. History loves assigning one hero, even when reality involved an entire generation of innovators. 23. The phrase "survival of the fittest" has convinced countless students that Charles Darwin believed nature always favors the biggest, strongest, or most aggressive creatures. That's not what Darwin meant at all. In fact, Darwin never originally coined the phrase. It was introduced by philosopher Herbert Spencer and only later adopted in later editions of Darwin's work. More importantly, fittest doesn't mean strongest. It means best adapted to a particular environment. Sometimes that means being fast. Sometimes it means being small enough to hide, clever enough to cooperate, or flexible enough to survive changing conditions. Tiny insects have outlived enormous predators. Fragile-looking plants thrive where massive trees cannot. Even cooperation can become an evolutionary advantage. Nature rewards whatever works, not whatever looks impressive. Unfortunately, the phrase has been misunderstood for generations and even misused to justify ideas that Darwin himself never proposed. Evolution isn't a tournament for bodybuilders, it's a never-ending test of adaptation, where today's unlikely survivor often becomes tomorrow's greatest success story. 24. Most history classes leave the impression that pirates spent their lives bearing enormous chests of gold on deserted islands marked with mysterious X's. You can thank adventure novels more than actual history for that image. Real pirates rarely buried treasure because stolen goods needed to be divided and spent quickly. Their loot often consisted of cargo like sugar, spices, cloth, tobacco, timber, food, or barrels of alcohol, rather than glittering piles of gold coins. Any valuable currency they captured usually disappeared into taverns, gambling houses, repairs for their ships, or supplies for the next voyage. The famous buried treasure legend became enormously popular after Robert Louis Stevenson's novel Treasure Island introduced generations of readers to maps, hidden chests, and secret islands. There are a few isolated historical cases of valuables being hidden temporarily, but they were extremely uncommon. The average pirate wasn't planning for retirement by hiding riches under a palm tree. He was much more likely to spend his profits before the next storm, battle, or hanging ended his remarkably short career. 25. Many people still believe that medieval knights were so heavy in their armor that once they fell off their horses, they couldn't stand up without being lifted by several helpers. It's a funny mental image, but historical evidence tells a different story. A complete suit of well-made plate armor generally weighed between 45 and 60 pounds, with the weight carefully distributed across the body. Modern soldiers often carry heavier loads in backpacks. Knights trained from childhood to fight, ride, run, climb, and even wrestle while wearing armor. Historical manuals describe athletic combat techniques that would have been impossible if warriors could barely move. Modern demonstrations by trained reenactors regularly show people sprinting, rolling, mounting horses, and standing up easily while wearing accurate reproductions. The myth probably grew from ceremonial armor displayed in museums, which was often much heavier and designed for tournaments rather than battle. Real battlefield armor represented centuries of engineering designed to maximize protection without sacrificing mobility. Medieval blacksmiths understood something simple. Armor that prevented movement would also prevent survival. 26. The famous phrase, "Houston, we have a problem," has become one of the most recognizable lines in movie history, but it isn't exactly what was said during the Apollo 13 mission. When an oxygen tank exploded in April 1970, astronaut Jack Swigert calmly radioed Mission Control with the words, "Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here." Commander Jim Lovell then repeated the message in a similarly measured tone. The difference seems small, but it reflects the extraordinary professionalism inside the spacecraft. There was no dramatic shouting or panicked announcement. The crew immediately began assessing the damage, while engineers on Earth searched for solutions. The version everyone remembers came from the 1995 Hollywood film Apollo 13 because "Houston, we have a problem" sounded more immediate and worked better dramatically. Ironically, the simplified movie quote became more famous than the actual words spoken during one of NASA's greatest survival stories. Sometimes Hollywood only changes a few words, but those few words become the version remembered by millions for decades afterward. 27. It's surprisingly common to hear that Albert Einstein failed mathematics as a child before becoming the greatest physicist of the 20th century. The story is often used to encourage struggling students, but it simply isn't true. Einstein excelled in mathematics from an early age. By his early teens, he had already mastered algebra, geometry, and advanced mathematical concepts far beyond the level expected in school. Part of the confusion comes from differences in grading systems. At one point, a misunderstanding of Swiss school records led some people to believe low numbers represented failing grades, when in fact they indicated excellent performance. Einstein himself eventually laughed at the rumor, pointing out that he had mastered differential and integral calculus long before most students even encountered algebra. His academic record wasn't perfect. He occasionally clashed with teachers and disliked rigid classroom discipline, but mathematics was never his weakness. The real lesson from Einstein's life isn't that genius failed math. It's that curiosity, persistence, and independent thinking often matter just as much as memorizing the right answers. 28. Every Thanksgiving, millions of people picture Benjamin Franklin desperately trying to make the turkey America's national bird instead of the bald eagle. It's a charming story, but it simplifies what actually happened. Franklin never officially proposed replacing the bald eagle with a turkey. After the Great Seal of the United States had already been approved, he privately wrote a humorous letter criticizing the bald eagle's behavior, calling it a bird with questionable moral character because it often stole food caught by other birds. In the same playful letter, Franklin jokingly praised the turkey as a more respectable and truly American animal. It was less a serious political campaign and more a witty observation shared with family. Franklin supported many practical ideas during his remarkable career, but redesigning the national symbol wasn't one of them. Over time, his sarcastic comments escaped their original context and transformed into another historical myth. Somehow, a private joke ended up becoming classroom trivia repeated for generations, as though it had been official government policy. 29. The French Revolution is often summarized with one simple sentence. The starving poor rose up because there wasn't enough bread. Bread shortages certainly played an important role, but reducing the revolution to a food crisis misses the much larger picture. By the late 18th century, France faced enormous government debt after expensive wars, including financial support for the American Revolution. The tax system heavily burdened ordinary people, while many nobles and clergy enjoyed significant privileges. Enlightenment thinkers questioned absolute monarchy, and economic hardship increased public frustration. Poor harvests caused bread prices to soar, making daily survival even harder. But that was only one ingredient in an already explosive situation. Political inequality, financial collapse, social resentment, and demands for reform had been building for decades. Revolutions rarely begin because of a single event. They happen when many problems collide at the same time. Bread became the symbol people remembered because everyone understood hunger, but the deeper causes reached into nearly every corner of French society. 31 of the oldest historical myths claims that ancient Egyptians built the pyramids with the help of mysterious alien visitors because humans couldn't possibly have achieved such precision thousands of years ago. The evidence overwhelmingly says otherwise. Archaeologists have uncovered quarry sites, unfinished blocks, workers' villages, tools, ramps, written records, and even graffiti left behind by construction crews proudly naming their work teams. These discoveries reveal an extraordinary human achievement driven by organization, engineering, mathematics, and decades of labor. Ancient Egyptians understood surveying techniques with remarkable accuracy, transported enormous stone blocks using carefully planned methods, and coordinated thousands of skilled workers over many years. Every new archaeological discovery continues strengthening the human explanation while weakening the alien theory. Ironically, attributing the pyramids to extraterrestrials often underestimates the intelligence and capabilities of one of history's greatest civilizations. The pyramids don't prove visitors came from another planet. They prove that determined people, armed with ingenuity, planning, and persistence, can accomplish feats so extraordinary that later generations struggle to believe human hands built them at all. 31. Nearly everyone has heard that medieval Europeans believed spices were used to hide the taste of rotten meat because people regularly ate spoiled food. It sounds believable until you think about one important detail. Spices were incredibly expensive. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg traveled thousands of miles through dangerous trade routes, making them luxury products worth small fortunes. Wealthy families didn't waste valuable spices trying to rescue meat that had already gone bad. In fact, spoiled meat could make people seriously ill, and even without modern refrigeration, most households understood the dangers of eating food that had started to rot. Meat was usually preserved through salting, smoking, drying, or pickling long before it became unsafe. When spices appeared in recipes, they were used to enhance flavor and display wealth, much like serving expensive wine today. The myth probably grew because medieval cooking often combined sweet and savory ingredients in ways that seem unusual to modern tastes. What looks strange to us wasn't an attempt to disguise spoiled food. It was simply the fashion of fine dining hundreds of years ago. 32 School history often leaves the impression that the Roman Empire collapsed almost overnight when barbarian tribes stormed into the city of Rome in AD 476. It's a neat ending, but real history almost never works that way. By the time the last Western emperor was removed from power, the empire had already been struggling for centuries with political instability, civil wars, economic problems, inflation, military pressure, and declining tax revenues. Emperors came and went with astonishing speed, while rival generals constantly fought for control. Meanwhile, the Eastern Roman Empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, continued to survive for nearly another 1,000 years, until the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Even in Western Europe, Roman law, engineering, language, and culture remained deeply influential long after the political system disappeared. The Roman Empire didn't simply vanish one afternoon. It slowly transformed into something new over generations. History textbooks often prefer dramatic endings, but the fall of Rome looked less like a collapsing building and more like a candle that gradually burned lower until only part of the flame remained. 33. One of the most repeated stories about the American West claims that cowboys spent their evenings wearing enormous 10-gallon hats. The hats were certainly real, but the name is misleading. Contrary to popular belief, a 10-gallon hat doesn't actually hold 10 gallons of water. If you tried, the brim would collapse long before you finished pouring. Most historians believe the name probably evolved from the Spanish word galán, which referred to decorative braid or trim, rather than a measurement of liquid. Others argue it simply became a colorful marketing term as Western fashion grew more popular in the late 19th century. Cowboy hats were practical pieces of equipment. They protected riders from the blazing sun, heavy rain, dust storms, and even served as makeshift buckets for giving horses small amounts of water. Their value came from versatility, not impossible storage capacity. Like many legends of the Wild West, the famous name became bigger than the reality. Sometimes a good story spreads faster than basic mathematics ever could. 34. Ask almost anyone what happened during the famous Boston Tea Party, and they'll probably say angry colonists dumped tea into Boston Harbor because they hated paying taxes. Taxes certainly played a role, but the protest was far more specific than many history lessons suggest. Ironically, the Tea Act of 1773 actually lowered the price of legally imported tea by allowing the British East India Company to sell directly to the colonies. The real issue was principle, not price. Many colonists objected to Parliament claiming the authority to tax them without colonial representation. They feared accepting even a cheaper product would quietly acknowledge Britain's right to govern them without their consent. That's why protesters targeted only the tea while carefully avoiding other cargo aboard the ships. Their goal wasn't random destruction, but a symbolic rejection of political authority they believed was illegitimate. It remains one of history's most famous examples of people refusing a bargain because accepting the discount would have meant surrendering something they valued even more than money. 35. One of the most popular misconceptions about the Middle Ages is that people expected the world to end when the calendar reached the year 1000. According to the legend, terrified Europeans abandoned their farms, crowded into churches, and waited for the apocalypse. Historians have searched contemporary records for evidence of widespread panic and found remarkably little. While some religious leaders certainly preached about the end of the world, as they had for centuries before and would continue to do afterward, there is no convincing evidence that Europe experienced a continent-wide wave of hysteria when the calendar changed. In fact, many ordinary people probably didn't even know the exact year, because standardized dating systems weren't part of daily life for most rural communities. The dramatic Millennium Panic story became popular centuries later, when writers looked back and imagined what such a milestone must have been like. It's another reminder that hindsight often creates better stories than the historical record actually provides. Sometimes the biggest event people expect simply never arrives. 36 Cleopatra is frequently described as an Egyptian queen in the same sense as the pharaohs who built the pyramids. While she absolutely ruled Egypt, her family background tells a different story. Cleopatra VII belonged to the Ptolemaic dynasty, established after Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in the 4th century BC. The Ptolemies were of Macedonian Greek origin and ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries while maintaining many Greek traditions. What made Cleopatra remarkable wasn't simply that she became queen. Unlike many of her predecessors, she learned the Egyptian language alongside several others, allowing her to communicate directly with many of her subjects. She embraced Egyptian customs while skillfully navigating both local politics and the expanding power of Rome. Another surprising fact is that Cleopatra lived much closer to the invention of the smartphone than to the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Ancient Egypt lasted so long that even Cleopatra looked back at the pyramid builders as figures from an incredibly distant past. 37. One of the oldest historical sayings claims that people in ancient Rome constantly gave a dramatic thumbs down to order defeated gladiators killed. Hollywood has turned the gesture into one of the most recognizable symbols of the Roman Empire. But historians aren't actually sure that's what happened. Ancient sources describe officials giving hand signals to indicate whether a gladiator should live or die, yet they rarely explain the exact position of the thumb. Some scholars believe an extended thumb may actually have represented a drawn sword, signaling death, while a concealed thumb tucked into the fist could have symbolized sheathing the weapon, meaning mercy. In other words, the famous modern gesture may be completely reversed. Paintings created during the 19th century helped popularize the familiar thumbs-down image, and filmmakers eagerly copied it because audiences instantly understood its meaning. The result is another case where artistic tradition became stronger than historical evidence. The Roman crowd certainly had opinions about gladiators, but exactly how they expressed those opinions remains surprisingly uncertain. 38 Many people believe the Magna Carta instantly created modern democracy and guaranteed equal rights for everyone in England. In reality, the famous document of 1215 was much more limited. King John agreed to the charter after rebellious barons forced him into negotiations during a political crisis. Most of its provisions dealt with feudal obligations, property rights, taxation, and the privileges of the nobility rather than ordinary citizens. In fact, many people living in medieval England would never have noticed its immediate effects. However, the Magna Carta became historically important because later generations repeatedly returned to it as a symbol that even a king should be subject to the law. Lawyers, judges, and political thinkers gradually expanded its influence over centuries, using its principles to support ideas about due process, representative government, and individual rights. The document's greatest achievement wasn't what it accomplished in 1215, but what people believed it represented afterward. Sometimes history's most powerful legacy comes not from immediate results, but from the ideas future generations continue building upon. 39. The Industrial Revolution is often portrayed as a moment when brilliant inventors suddenly filled the world with machines and transformed society almost overnight. The reality unfolded much more gradually. New inventions such as the spinning jenny, steam engine improvements, mechanical looms, and better iron production techniques certainly accelerated industrial growth. But the transition took decades. Many families continued farming while also working in small workshops, and traditional crafts survived alongside factories for generations. Railroads spread slowly across countries, cities expanded unevenly, and different industries modernized at different speeds. Entire communities experienced industrialization years before neighboring regions did. The revolution wasn't a single event, but a long chain of innovations, investments, population changes, and economic shifts that reshaped daily life piece by piece. Looking back, it appears like one dramatic turning point because historians compress decades into a few textbook pages. People living through it, however, rarely realized they were witnessing one of history's greatest transformations until it had already changed nearly every aspect of their lives. 41 of the most familiar stories about the American Civil War claims it was fought entirely over states' rights, while others insist it was only about slavery. The historical reality requires a little more precision. Southern political leaders repeatedly argued that individual states possessed significant constitutional powers, but when they explained why they chose secession, their official declarations consistently centered on protecting slavery as the institution they believed those rights should preserve. The debates involved constitutional questions, federal authority, economics, political power, and territorial expansion. Yet, slavery stood at the center of nearly every major disagreement dividing North and South. Simplifying the conflict into a single slogan leaves out the complexity of how political systems actually function. Understanding history means reading what participants themselves wrote rather than relying on later summaries. The Civil War wasn't caused by one isolated event or one sentence that fits neatly on a classroom poster. It emerged from decades of growing conflict over the future of slavery within the United States and the constitutional questions surrounding it. 41. One of the most common stories about medieval castles is that boiling oil was routinely poured over attacking armies during every siege. It certainly makes for dramatic movies, but historians have found very little evidence that this was standard practice. Oil was expensive, difficult to store in large quantities, and far too valuable to waste if cheaper alternatives were available. Castle defenders were much more likely to throw rocks, heavy beams, sand heated over fires, boiling water, or quicklime at attackers trying to climb walls. These weapons were easier to prepare and just as effective at stopping soldiers packed tightly beneath the battlements. Ancient military manuals occasionally mention hot oil, but usually in exceptional circumstances, rather than as a normal defensive tactic. Hollywood embraced the image because streams of flaming oil create unforgettable action scenes. The reality was far less cinematic, but far more practical. Medieval commanders understood logistics better than special effects, and they rarely chose the most expensive weapon when several cheaper ones could accomplish exactly the same terrifying result. 42. Ask someone why the ancient city of Pompeii disappeared, and they'll probably say it was buried under rivers of lava from Mount Vesuvius. Surprisingly, lava wasn't what destroyed the city. During the eruption of AD 79, Pompeii was first covered by falling volcanic ash and pumice that collapsed roofs and trapped thousands of residents. The deadliest phase came later, when scorching clouds of superheated gas, ash, and volcanic debris, known as pyroclastic flows and surges, raced down the mountain at incredible speed. These deadly currents reached temperatures high enough to kill almost instantly and buried the city beneath layers of volcanic material. Modern excavations have revealed astonishingly preserved buildings, frescoes, tools, food, and even the empty spaces left by human bodies, allowing archaeologists to create plaster casts that captured victims' final moments. Pompeii wasn't swallowed by glowing rivers of molten rock like in disaster movies. It vanished beneath an avalanche of volcanic ash and lethal heat, leaving behind one of history's most remarkable archaeological time capsules. 43. One persistent myth claims that medieval doctors believed bloodletting could cure almost every disease simply because they didn't understand medicine. While bloodletting was certainly practiced for centuries, the story is more complicated than it first appears. Physicians based their treatments on the ancient theory of the four bodily humors, believing health depended on maintaining a balance between blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. When patients showed certain symptoms, doctors concluded that removing blood might restore equilibrium. Today we know that theory was incorrect, but it wasn't random superstition. It represented the best medical framework available based on centuries of observation and inherited knowledge. Even more interesting, bloodletting occasionally produced limited benefits for a few rare conditions involving excess iron or abnormal blood cell production, though physicians had no idea why. Medicine has always advanced by replacing old explanations with better evidence rather than beginning with perfect knowledge. Looking back, it's easy to criticize historical medicine, but future generations may one day view some of our own treatments with the very same mixture of disbelief and curiosity. 44. It's often said that medieval people thought spices, silk, and other luxury goods were worth traveling halfway around the world simply because they had no local alternatives. In reality, the global trade routes that connected Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East were driven by much more than curiosity or necessity. Products like black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, fine textiles, precious stones, porcelain, and perfumes became symbols of wealth and status among Europe's elite. Merchants accepted enormous risks crossing deserts, mountains, and oceans because the profits could be extraordinary. Long before Columbus sailed west, sophisticated trade networks already linked civilizations across thousands of miles through caravans and maritime routes. These exchanges also spread mathematics, scientific knowledge, technologies, religious ideas, languages, and artistic traditions. The so-called Age of Exploration expanded these connections dramatically, but it certainly didn't invent global trade. History often makes earlier societies seem isolated when, in reality, they were participating in surprisingly complex international economies that stretched across continents centuries before modern globalization became a familiar word. 45. One famous classroom myth suggests that Marco Polo was the first European to discover China. While Marco Polo's travels remain extraordinary, China had been known in Europe long before his famous journey. Ancient Roman writers described a distant land they called Ceres, famous for producing luxurious silk, even though they had only indirect knowledge of its location. Merchants, diplomats, missionaries, and travelers had moved along sections of the Silk Road for centuries before Marco Polo was born. What made his account remarkable was not that he discovered China, but that he left one of the most detailed descriptions of life under the Mongol Empire available to European readers. His stories introduced audiences to paper money, enormous cities, advanced canals, and sophisticated government systems that sounded almost unbelievable at the time. Some readers even doubted his accounts because they seemed too fantastic to be true. Marco Polo didn't reveal a hidden civilization to Europe. He helped Europeans understand one they had only vaguely imagined for generations. 46. A surprisingly common belief is that people during the Renaissance suddenly woke up one morning, abandoned medieval thinking, and immediately entered the modern world. History rarely works with such dramatic scene changes. The Renaissance unfolded gradually between the 14th and 17th centuries, beginning in parts of Italy before spreading unevenly across Europe. Many medieval traditions continued alongside new artistic styles, scientific discoveries, and humanist philosophy. Gothic cathedrals were still being built, while Renaissance painters experimented with perspective. Scholars translated ancient Greek texts, while universities continued teaching older subjects. Printing transformed communication, but handwritten manuscripts remained common for generations. Rather than replacing one civilization overnight, the Renaissance layered new ideas onto existing foundations. Looking backward, historians often divide time into neat periods because it helps organize complicated events. The people living through those centuries, however, rarely recognized clear boundaries. They experienced constant change mixed with remarkable continuity. The Renaissance wasn't a sudden rebirth after centuries of darkness. It was a long conversation between old traditions and new possibilities that gradually reshaped Europe. 47. Many history books create the impression that the Black Death wiped out exactly 1/3 of Europe's population, as though someone carefully counted every victim. While modern historians estimate that between 30 and 50% of Europe's population died during the pandemic of the 14th century, no precise number exists. Record-keeping varied enormously between regions, and many local documents disappeared over time. Some villages lost nearly everyone, while other communities suffered far lighter losses. The plague itself also returned repeatedly over the following centuries, rather than ending after one devastating outbreak. Recent scientific research has confirmed that the disease was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, usually spread through fleas carried by rodents, although human parasites and respiratory transmission likely contributed under certain conditions. Regardless of the exact percentage, the demographic impact was staggering. Labor shortages transformed agriculture, wages increased in many places, and long-established social structures began shifting in unexpected ways. Sometimes the exact numbers matter less than understanding how profoundly an event reshaped an entire civilization. 48. One enduring myth claims that George Washington chopped down a cherry tree as a boy and bravely confessed, "I cannot tell a lie." It's one of America's best-known childhood stories, and almost entirely fictional. The tale first appeared years after Washington's death in a biography written by Mason Locke Weems, who wanted to teach children moral lessons through entertaining stories. Weems openly included invented anecdotes designed to illustrate Washington's honesty, courage, and virtue rather than provide strict historical documentation. The cherry tree episode became especially popular because it perfectly captured the kind of character parents hoped children would imitate. Over time, many readers forgot that the story originated as moral literature rather than eyewitness history. Washington certainly developed a reputation for integrity throughout his military and political career, but no reliable contemporary source mentions the famous cherry tree incident. Ironically, one of the most celebrated lessons about honesty became famous through a story that historians agree almost certainly never happened. 49. One of the greatest misconceptions about the Wright brothers is that they simply built an airplane, flew it once, and instantly changed transportation forever. The first successful powered flight at Kitty Hawk in 1903 lasted only 12 seconds and covered just 120 feet. It was an extraordinary achievement, but it was only the beginning. Wilbur and Orville Wright spent years studying aerodynamics, building gliders, testing wings in homemade wind tunnels, and solving the difficult problem of controlling an aircraft in 3 dimensions. After their first flight, they continued refining their machines, extending flight times from seconds to minutes, and eventually demonstrating practical aircraft before skeptical governments and investors. Many newspapers initially ignored or doubted their accomplishments because the claims sounded unbelievable. Aviation didn't emerge from one lucky afternoon on a windy beach. It resulted from relentless experimentation, careful engineering, repeated failures, and an extraordinary willingness to learn from every mistake. The miracle wasn't simply leaving the ground. It was refusing to stop improving after those first 12 unforgettable seconds. 51 of the biggest historical lies taught through countless simplified timelines is that history moves forward in a straight line, with each generation automatically becoming smarter, wiser, and more advanced than the one before it. Real history tells a much messier story. Civilizations rise, flourish, decline, and sometimes lose knowledge that later generations must rediscover. Ancient engineers built structures that still challenge modern experts. Medieval scholars preserved classical learning that might otherwise have vanished. Indigenous societies developed sophisticated agricultural systems perfectly adapted to their environments long before modern science understood why they worked so well. Every era has produced remarkable innovations alongside costly mistakes, brilliant thinkers alongside dangerous misconceptions. Looking backward, it's tempting to imagine the past as one long march from ignorance to enlightenment. In reality, history resembles a winding road filled with breakthroughs, setbacks, forgotten discoveries, and unexpected surprises. Perhaps the greatest lesson history teaches is that every generation believes it finally has all the answers, until the next generation politely proves otherwise. 51. One of the most persistent historical myths claims that medieval Europeans believed sailing beyond the horizon would send ships plunging off the edge of the earth. The truth is almost the complete opposite. By the Middle Ages, educated Europeans had inherited centuries of knowledge from Greek and Roman scholars who understood the earth was spherical. Medieval universities taught this concept, sailors relied on it, and scholars regularly discussed the planet's size and shape. The real debate during the Age of Exploration wasn't whether the Earth was round, it was how large it actually was. Christopher Columbus famously underestimated its circumference, believing Asia was much closer than most experts calculated. Ironically, the people often portrayed as backward were actually much more accurate than Columbus himself. The flat Earth myth only became widespread in the 19th century when some writers exaggerated medieval ignorance to create a dramatic story about progress. History loves simple heroes and foolish villains, but reality is usually less theatrical. In this case, the classrooms got the geography wrong while trying to explain how someone else supposedly misunderstood it. 52. It's easy to believe that ancient civilizations had little understanding of astronomy because they lacked telescopes, satellites, and modern computers. Yet many people are surprised to learn just how sophisticated ancient observers actually were. Babylonian astronomers recorded planetary movements with astonishing precision. Egyptian priests aligned monuments with celestial events, and the Maya developed calendars so accurate that they still impress researchers today. Greek astronomers, such as Hipparchus, discovered the precession of Earth's axis centuries before modern science explained it, while Eratosthenes calculated Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy, using nothing more than shadows, geometry, and careful observation. They certainly didn't know everything, but they understood far more than popular culture often suggests. Modern technology has expanded human knowledge enormously, yet many ancient discoveries were achieved with patience, mathematics, and generations of careful record-keeping. Looking through a telescope is impressive. Measuring the world correctly without one may be even more remarkable. Ancient astronomers remind us that brilliant thinking often matters more than sophisticated equipment. 53. Many people grow up believing that knights always rescued princesses trapped inside castles, while dragons lurked somewhere nearby. That's less history and more medieval fantasy blended with Victorian storytelling. Real medieval knights spent most of their lives serving local lords, collecting taxes, managing estates, fighting political rivals, or participating in military campaigns. Their daily responsibilities often resembled those of professional soldiers mixed with landowners rather than fairy tale heroes. The romantic image of chivalrous knights rescuing helpless maidens became especially popular centuries later through poems, novels, and eventually Hollywood films. Medieval literature certainly included heroic adventures, but readers at the time understood many of those stories as entertainment rather than historical accounts. Real castles were administrative centers, military fortresses, and family homes filled with paperwork, livestock, servants, and practical concerns. They contained far more accountants than dragons. Sometimes history becomes stranger than fiction, precisely because ordinary life rarely follows the exciting script that later generations wish it had. 54. One of the biggest misunderstandings about ancient Rome is that everyone wore spotless white togas while strolling through elegant marble streets. In reality, togas were surprisingly uncomfortable and impractical garments reserved for specific occasions. Most Roman citizens preferred wearing simple tunics during everyday activities because they were easier to move in, cheaper to maintain, and far more suitable for work. A toga required careful wrapping, restricted movement, and often became dirty quickly in crowded cities filled with smoke, mud, animals, and busy marketplaces. It also symbolized citizenship, meaning women, enslaved people, foreigners, and many workers rarely wore one. The gleaming white marble cities shown in modern illustrations were also far more colorful than many people realize. Temples and statues were frequently painted in bright reds, blues, greens, and gold. Time gradually stripped away those pigments, leaving behind the white stone we see today. Ancient Rome wasn't a minimalist city dressed in white. It was noisy, colorful, crowded, and far more vibrant than its modern ruins suggest. 55. It's often said that the Vikings were filthy barbarians who cared only about fighting and plundering. Archaeological discoveries paint a surprisingly different picture. Excavations across Scandinavia and former Viking settlements have uncovered combs, tweezers, ear cleaners, razors, and other grooming tools in remarkable numbers. Written accounts from neighboring cultures even complained that Viking men bathed regularly and kept themselves well-groomed, making them unexpectedly attractive to local women. In England, some observers noted that Norse settlers washed at least once a week, which was more frequently than many of their contemporaries. None of this excuses the violence associated with Viking raids, but it reminds us that history is rarely black and white. The same people capable of terrifying military expeditions also valued craftsmanship, trade, exploration, poetry, and personal appearance. Modern stereotypes often reduce entire civilizations to a single characteristic. The Vikings certainly knew how to swing an axe, but they apparently knew how to use a comb almost as well. 56. One common myth claims that medieval maps were hopelessly inaccurate because people had no idea what the world looked like. While some decorative maps mixed geography with religious symbolism, skilled cartographers produced surprisingly sophisticated work using the knowledge available at the time. Sailors relied on detailed portolan charts that accurately showed coastlines, harbors, and sailing routes throughout the Mediterranean and parts of the Atlantic. These maps emphasized practical navigation rather than artistic perfection and were updated as new information became available. As exploration expanded, mapmakers constantly revised their work, correcting mistakes and incorporating fresh discoveries. Cartography has always been an evolving science rather than a finished product. Modern maps also change regularly as technology improves and borders shift. Looking back, it's tempting to laugh at old maps showing unexplored regions filled with mythical creatures or empty spaces. Yet those drawings often reflected honest admissions of uncertainty rather than ignorance. A blank area on a medieval map sometimes meant exactly what every good scientist still says today: we don't know yet. 57. The famous image of Leonardo da Vinci often suggests he spent every waking hour painting masterpieces like the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper. While those works secured his place in history, painting occupied only part of his astonishing career. Leonardo filled thousands of notebook pages with sketches exploring anatomy, engineering, architecture, geology, hydraulics, optics, flight, military technology, and countless other subjects. He dissected human bodies to better understand muscles and bones, designed bridges and canals, studied bird flight in hopes of creating flying machines, and constantly observed nature with extraordinary curiosity. Ironically, he completed relatively few paintings because he frequently became distracted by new ideas before finishing previous projects. Patrons sometimes grew frustrated waiting years for promised work. Leonardo's greatest talent may not have been painting alone, but his relentless desire to understand how everything functioned. He reminds us that genuine curiosity rarely stays confined within one profession. The Renaissance ideal wasn't mastering a single skill. It was refusing to stop asking questions about the world. 58. One of the most famous stories about the Great Fire of London in 1666 claims that it completely destroyed the city and forced everyone to start over from nothing. The fire was certainly catastrophic, destroying thousands of buildings, churches, and homes over 4 days, but the story is often exaggerated in important ways. Large sections of London survived untouched, including areas outside the old medieval city walls. Even more surprising, despite the enormous destruction, the officially recorded death toll remained remarkably low, although historians continue debating whether some victims went unrecorded. The rebuilding process transformed London's streets, improved building regulations, and encouraged greater use of brick and stone instead of timber, helping reduce the risk of future disasters. Rather than ending London's story, the fire marked the beginning of a massive urban redesign that shaped the city for centuries. Sometimes destruction becomes remembered so vividly that people forget what survived. London wasn't erased from history in 1666. It adapted, rebuilt, and emerged stronger than before. 59. One widespread misconception suggests that the American Revolution instantly created a perfectly united nation immediately after independence. In reality, winning the war was only the beginning of an enormous political challenge. Under the Articles of Confederation, the new United States struggled with debt, weak central authority, trade disputes between states, and limited power to collect taxes. Political leaders fiercely debated how much authority the national government should possess, leading to the Constitutional Convention of 1787 and the creation of the Constitution. Even after that, disagreements remained intense, giving rise to the country's first political parties. Regional differences, economic interests, and competing visions of government continued shaping American politics from the very beginning. Independence solved one major problem while revealing many others. History often presents revolutions as neat endings, but they usually mark the start of difficult nation-building efforts. Creating a country proved every bit as challenging as winning one. The United States wasn't born fully finished. It spent decades discovering exactly what kind of nation it wanted to become. 61. Final historical myth deserves special attention because it quietly influences almost every other misconception on this list. We often imagine history as a collection of fixed stories that never change once they're written into textbooks. In reality, history is constantly being refined as archaeologists uncover new evidence, historians analyze forgotten documents, scientists develop better dating techniques, and researchers challenge long-held assumptions. That doesn't mean everything changes every year, nor does it mean facts are endlessly flexible. It means our understanding becomes more accurate as better evidence appears. New discoveries have reshaped what we know about ancient migrations, lost civilizations, famous battles, historical diseases, and even the daily lives of ordinary people who rarely appeared in traditional textbooks. The greatest lie history class sometimes teaches isn't any single myth about kings, explorers, or wars. It's the idea that learning history ever truly ends. The past doesn't change, but our ability to understand it certainly does. And that's exactly what keeps history endlessly fascinating, generation after generation. 61. One of the most familiar stories about the Pilgrims claims they landed on Plymouth Rock because they carefully chose it as the perfect place to begin a new colony. The truth is much less dramatic. There is no contemporary record from 1620 mentioning the famous rock at all. The story only appeared more than a century later when an elderly man claimed his father had watched the Pilgrims step ashore there. By then, the event had already begun passing into legend. Historians believe the settlers probably landed at several locations while exploring the coastline before deciding where to establish Plymouth Colony. Even if some passengers did step onto the rock at some point, it almost certainly wasn't the symbolic moment later paintings imagined. The boulder itself has been moved, cracked, and broken over the centuries, with pieces even given away as souvenirs. Today, Plymouth Rock remains an important historical symbol, but its reputation owes more to American storytelling than to eyewitness evidence. Sometimes nations build monuments around stories because symbols can become just as powerful as documented facts. 62. Nearly everyone has heard that Marie Antoinette wasted her days hosting endless parties while France collapsed around her. Although the French queen certainly enjoyed the luxury expected of royalty, the popular image of her as a carefree spendthrift ignores the broader financial crisis that plagued France long before she arrived. By the time Louis XVI inherited the throne, the kingdom was already burdened with enormous debts accumulated through decades of warfare, including costly involvement in the American Revolution. Royal spending contributed to the problem, but it represented only part of a much larger economic disaster involving taxation, poor harvests, outdated financial systems, and political paralysis. Revolutionary propaganda turned Marie Antoinette into the perfect villain because she was foreign, fashionable, and highly visible. Countless exaggerated stories circulated about her supposed extravagance, many of which lacked credible evidence. She certainly made political mistakes, but reducing the collapse of the French monarchy to one queen's shopping habits oversimplifies one of Europe's most complicated historical crises. History rarely falls apart because of a single person's expensive wardrobe. 63. One of the most repeated claims about ancient Egypt is that the pyramids were built entirely with slave labor because no free people would willingly perform such exhausting work. Modern archaeology has steadily dismantled that assumption. Excavations near Giza have uncovered workers' settlements complete with bakeries, breweries, medical facilities, sleeping quarters, and carefully planned cemeteries reserved for laborers who helped construct the pyramids. These discoveries strongly suggest that many workers were respected craftsmen and seasonal laborers serving the state, rather than permanently enslaved people driven by whips. Ancient Egyptian society organized massive public projects through taxation, agricultural labor cycles, and centralized administration. During the annual flooding of the Nile, many farmers temporarily left their fields and worked on royal construction projects. The labor remained physically demanding and dangerous, but it reflected remarkable organization rather than simple brutality. The real achievement becomes even more impressive once we recognize that one of history's greatest engineering projects was accomplished through planning, logistics, mathematics, and skilled human effort instead of the simplistic image created by centuries of popular fiction. 64. Ask someone about the medieval Inquisition, and they'll often imagine millions of innocent people being executed across Europe. The historical reality is considerably more complicated and in many ways far less straightforward than popular culture suggests. Different inquisitions operated in different countries over several centuries with varying procedures, authorities, and outcomes. While there were unquestionably wrongful imprisonments, torture, and executions that remain deeply troubling, modern historians generally reject the enormous death tolls sometimes repeated in older books and films. Surviving records indicate that many investigations ended without execution, while punishments often included fines, pilgrimages, or public acts of repentance. None of this excuses the suffering caused by religious persecution, but accurate history requires distinguishing between documented evidence and later exaggeration. Popular imagination often combines several centuries of unrelated events into one terrifying narrative. The real history is serious enough without inflating the numbers. Understanding what actually happened allows us to appreciate both the dangers of intolerance and the importance of relying on evidence rather than emotionally satisfying myths. 65. One of the biggest misconceptions about the California gold rush is that nearly everyone who headed west became rich overnight simply by scooping gold from rivers. In reality, the overwhelming majority of prospectors never found enough gold to transform their lives. During the early months of 1848, valuable nuggets could indeed be collected from streams with relatively simple tools, but word spread quickly. Within a short time, hundreds of thousands of fortune seekers flooded California, making easy discoveries increasingly rare. Mining required expensive equipment, long hours, dangerous conditions, and a great deal of luck. Ironically, some of the people who became truly wealthy weren't miners at all. Shopkeepers, merchants, bankers, transportation companies, and entrepreneurs selling food, clothing, tools, and supplies often earned steadier profits than the prospectors they served. Levi Strauss famously built a successful business supplying durable clothing rather than digging for gold himself. The gold rush changed American history forever, but it created far more hopeful dreamers than instant millionaires. Once again, the legend proved richer than the average participant. 66. One of the most popular myths surrounding Albert Einstein claims he invented the atomic bomb through his scientific genius. The truth is much more nuanced. Einstein's groundbreaking work on relativity transformed modern physics, particularly his famous equation showing the relationship between mass and energy. However, he played no direct role in designing or building the atomic bombs used during World War II. In fact, Einstein never worked on the Manhattan Project because American officials considered him a potential security risk due to his political views and international connections. His involvement was limited primarily to signing a 1939 letter, drafted by fellow physicist Leo Szilard, warning President Franklin Roosevelt that Nazi Germany might attempt to develop nuclear weapons. That letter helped encourage early American research, but thousands of scientists and engineers later carried out the enormous technical work required to build the bomb. After the war, Einstein became an outspoken advocate for international cooperation and nuclear arms control. History often credits famous names with every major event connected to them, even when reality tells a far more complicated story. 67. Perhaps the biggest lie many of us learned in history class is that history belongs only to kings, presidents, generals, and famous inventors. Open almost any old textbook, and you'll find pages filled with battles, treaties, elections, and powerful leaders, while millions of ordinary people barely appear at all. Yet modern historians increasingly recognize that understanding the past also means studying farmers, teachers, merchants, nurses, factory workers, immigrants, sailors, craftsmen, and families whose names never appeared in official records. Archaeology, personal letters, diaries, court documents, newspapers, and DNA research have revealed that everyday people often shaped history in ways rulers never could. Major events certainly matter, but so do ordinary decisions repeated millions of times across generations. History isn't simply the story of extraordinary individuals changing the world, it's the story of countless ordinary people building it, feeding it, defending it, questioning it, and passing it on. Once you realize that, history stops feeling like a distant museum filled with famous names. It becomes the story of humanity itself, and suddenly, every chapter becomes worth reading. Thanks for watching. Which of these history myths surprised you the most? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget, sometimes the most unbelievable part of history isn't what happened. It's what we kept believing happened for generations.